Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Natalie Ellis with Esteem Counseling and Consulting Services, and this is Ask the Therapist with Natalie Ellis. And our topic today is children and suicide. As some of you may know, it is Suicide Awareness Month, and these next couple weeks I'm going to do different segments in regards to suicide. And this helps me when I do this research because, again, there's always new things coming out. And so today our topic is suicide in children. Next week I will talk about suicide with teens. And the week after that will be suicide with adults and the older population, geriatric. But today we're going to focus on children and suicide. And so what is suicide? So looking up some definitions of suicide, simply put, is the act of intentionally causing one's own death. Intentionally causing one's own death. And who, let me make sure this is up by volume. And so when we think about that, the act of causing one's own death, that must take a lot to get to that point. And so for individuals or for people to feel they need to get to that point, that's really overwhelming. For a child to feel as if that is the option that they have, or that is the only option that they have, to kill themselves. So the act of intentionally causing one's own death. And so according to the CDC, there's different statistics. According to the CDC, from 1999 to 2015, 1,309 children ages 5 to 12 died in the U.S. from suicide. Again, from 1999 to 2015, 1,309 children aged 5 to 12 died in the U.S. from suicide. That's significant. That's a big number. Okay, children from 11 to 12, from 5 to 12, intentionally causing their own death. Okay, and the numbers went up the years of 2013 to 2015. 54%, there was a 54% increase, age 11 to 12. Okay, so I'm curious as to what was going on at that time for there to be such an increase. Okay, and again, the numbers are continuously going up. That's the last solid statistics that I found. Okay, 70% of those kids were male. Okay, so just in general, as we talk about suicide, in general, males typically commit suicide in that through completion of suicide. However, more women generally attempt suicide. So females typically attempt suicide. However, more males complete suicide, if that makes sense. Okay? So out of the 1,309 students, 76% of those children were males. Okay? There's another particular research that talks about out of all the people or the children that committed suicide, the main diagnosis or the more common diagnosis were children with ADHD. And partly with ADHD, there's a symptom of impulsivity, whereas they do things without thinking. So that's the impulsivity. And so the correlation in that is the kids with the ADHD, when they're in this emotional state, they're not thinking about what they're doing. They're thinking they're doing without thinking. Okay? And so that's potentially why those numbers are so high with kids diagnosed with ADHD. Okay? So that's one research. Another research also talks about 36% of those students, of the 1,300 students, or children, I keep saying students, 36% of those children were African American children as well. So there's also an increase of Black or African American children who are committing suicide. And so these numbers, again, are alarming. So in 17 years, from 1999 to 2015, 1,300 students committed suicide between the age of 5 and 12. And that's significant, okay? So let's talk about a little bit about triggers that could lead to suicide, okay? One that's that seems to be a common theme that's talked a lot about too, is peer relationships. So bullying and peer relationships. A lot of these kids that have committed suicide, there's been incidences where they were bullied at school, or they were antagonized at school or ostracized at school, and that led them to commit suicide. So peer relationships and family relationships plays a big part in terms of how one feels about themselves as well. So that's something we have to pay attention to. Relationships, including peer relationships, which then leads to the bullying. So again, if you go to school or you go somewhere and often feel as if nobody likes you, or often feels as if you're being made fun of, that creates its own set of negative emotions and negative feelings and negative thoughts. Okay, so these are things to pay attention to. So bullying matters. Being in a place, or being at school, or being somewhere where where you don't feel welcome, it does take a toll to our mental health. Another trigger or factor to suicide is adverse experiences that individuals may go through as well. So there's a lot of kids who are dealing with physical abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence. So their homes are filled with a lot of overwhelming situations that they're unable to manage. Homelessness, poverty. And so some of those things can create a lot of overwhelming feelings that they may not know how to manage. And on top of that, also having to deal with poor peer relationships at school, okay, or in their homes. Okay, and another factor is obviously mental health problems. So all these things can lead to mental health problems. And so common diagnoses are ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, ADD, attention deficit disorder, depression. Depression is on the rise. Depression and anxiety are both on the rise for young kids. So those are things to be aware of. Okay, so mental health problems plays a big part in all these also. Again, our experiences can lead to mental health when they're not being treated or being taken care of properly in terms of support and services. When our relationships are poor and they're not being managed properly, that can lead to mental health problems. Okay, so signs in regards to depression and in regards to ultimately suicide, signs to be aware of is isolation, withdrawal, unhappiness, increase in aggression, increase in irritability. So all those are things to be aware of. And they do sound like symptoms of depression. Okay? And so these are things, again, as adults to be aware of that the kids are going through, and for the child themselves to be aware of as well. So when we're noticing that the child is isolating from peers, isolating from others, isolating from family members, withdrawing themselves from activities, no longer wanting to be involved in things that they used to like to do, increase unhappiness, shift in mood, more sleeping more, increase in irritability and aggression. Again, those are things we have to pay attention to as well. Okay, things we can do as parents, caretakers, teachers, and professionals. There's a lot of things we can do. For one thing, I will say we need to be more inquisitive. It's important to be inquisitive rather than being dismissive or punitive. Okay, we tend to dismiss children. We tend to dismiss what they're feeling. We tend to dismiss what they go through. And that can itself also lead to more isolation, more feelings of unworthiness. Okay, so it's important to be inquisitive rather than dismissive or punitive. Okay, by asking questions. It's important to ask his questions when we're noticing a change in behavior, when we're noticing poor social skills, poor interactions with others, sad mood. When we're noticing something, it's important to pay attention to what's going on, asking them questions rather than assuming, rather than dismissing what's going on with them. They're just kids. And oftentimes kids hear that and they tend to also dismiss what's going on with them. So it's important that we take notice, okay? So in taking notice, we have to turn towards children. Oftentimes children do seek help. They do want some type of attention. They do have a cry out for help. But again, when we're busy doing our own thing or focusing on other things or dismissing it, then we don't turn towards them and in turn don't hear what they're saying in their silences. So even in without the words, their actions and their behaviors do speak to us, and we need to pay attention to that. Okay? With that, it's important to seek out services through the school or through the community. Okay? And services can include a lot of things. Obviously, mental health counseling, psychiatric services is something that can be sought out as well. Educational supports. So again, when kids are saying that things are happening at school, it's important to set up meetings with the schools. It's important to determine whether or not we need to put a student support team in place, or do we need to put an IEP in place, individualized education plans in place. What things do we need to put in place to make sure that the child is supported and in turn successful? Okay, so these are things we need to notice. Extracurricular activities, that may also be something we need to put in place also for the child. Are there enough activities to keep them engaged, to keep them busy, to keep them stimulated? And so these are things that we may also need to look into. Okay, and in regards to counseling, there's an array counseling services out there, whether it's individual therapy, group therapy, family therapy. And once they get into counseling, there's an assessment that will be done. And in the assessment is to determine, whether or not there is a diagnosis. And from that diagnosis, proper treatment will start to happen. Okay? And so there's steps of things that could happen, but definitely there's services out there. There's supports out there for the child and for the parent and caretakers and all that. And so, again, children in suicide, that is something that's significant. That's something we cannot ignore. We cannot ignore what kids are feeling, what kids are going through. It's important that we are inquisitive, that we ask questions, and that we pay attention to what our kids are going through, okay, and help them seek the help that they need. Okay, thank you. So I hope this was a little bit helpful, and like I said, every week for this month we'll talk about different aspects of suicide, and today was children in suicide, and I did want to bring that up because that is something that's more and more we're hearing about kids taking their own lives for various reasons. And so again, children need to be heard, and so ultimately that's the key. They need to be heard. So as the adults around them, we need to make sure we're providing them with support and services. Okay, thank you. This is Natalie Ellis on Ask the Therapist, and I will see you next Wednesday at noon. Thank you so much for joining me.